Hey, it's David Priemer here from Cerebral Selling, and welcome to the Mark Raffan negotiation webinar recording. I gotta say, I just got off the webinar with Mark. I am super pumped. He dropped so many awesome pearls of wisdom about how to minimize the concessions that you're giving away during, normal periods, but especially during high pressure negotiation periods. And, man after my own heart, he spoke a lot about many cerebral concepts as they relate to negotiation. Things like feelings and time pressure and satisfaction and the emotional motivators, and being able to kind of sense from an empathetic standpoint the feelings that are present in the other person, what their motivators are. I'm confident you're going to get a ton of value from this recording around minimizing, not only minimizing the concessions that you give at the end of your quarter, at the end of your month, in your high pressure periods, but also increasing the level of satisfaction that your customers have in the overall process. You're going to hear things around, again, concession management. You're going to hear things around time management, and then also, emotional regulation as well. So I'm confident you're going to get a ton of value, and enjoy the recording. Negotiation is always certainly a popular topic, but working in the high-tech growth industry as I do, and I'm sure Mark does as well, making Q4 big, which to some extent we all find ourselves in at this moment in time, is really important. And especially now with what's going on in the economy and the world, there seems to be like an increased focus, not only on making Q4 big, but in a world where, every lead and every opportunity is precious, we need to preserve as much of our revenue as we can. And, I'll tell you, as we kind of kick things off with Mark, one of the things, and I was saying this to Mark earlier in the week, one of the things I kind of remember about Mark kind of being coming kind of from the procurement side and talking about negotiations now as he does, there is a tactic that I cover in my curriculum. I'm actually going to Zoom chat you all here. And by the way, if you have any questions, well, I'll ask for questions later on, but if you have any questions, pop it in the Zoom chat. There is a little giveaway I have here. You don't have to register for anything. Just click this link that I popped in the Zoom chat. This is this little PDF I call the Ultimate Guide for Q4 Sales Negotiations. But the secret is you can use it whenever you want for negotiations. Q4 is just marketing, right? And so the idea here is there's all these tactics we use to negotiate when our kind of quota and month end is on the line. And, one of the tactics I talk about, and me, I love the science-based tactics, research-based tactics, is this concept of when someone gets presented with, I'm gonna loop Mark into this story, but when someone gets presented with, an opportunity as a seller to grant a concession, the thing that we think about is like, oh, I have to do this. Like if I don't give the thing what the customer's saying, I'm going to lose the deal. And back at Salesforce, of course, we would see this a lot. Young, enthusiastic sellers, and they go out there, and there's this one particular story I remember, and I'll kind of loop this into the tactic, and then we'll loop Mark in. I remember this story where we obviously tried to push for annual upfront contracts at Salesforce in our deals. And so, a rep goes out and he's working this big deal, and he says to the customer, like, great, here's the price we agreed on. And it's like annual upfront payments. And the customer's like, oh, what, comes back a few days before the deadline and says, I don't know if this is going to work. Can we get quarterly payments? Now, to get quarterly payment, you can't just give away quarterly payments at Salesforce. You need special approval for that. So the rep comes back, to me and says, hey, David, can we get approval for quarterly payments? I have this customer. We're just about to push them over the finish line, and this is the last thing. It's all good. And I'm like, do we have to give quarterly payment? Like, we don't want to give away things that we don't need to. I'm like, do we have to give quarterly payments? He's like, David, I don't know. Like, we have this deal. Like, can we just give them the quarterly payments and just take it off the table? And so I'm like, you know what? I think we have, are we the selected vendor? Are we the one they want to work with? Yes, yes, yes. Okay. You know what? I think we actually have more power than we think. Go back to the customer and ask the customer if this is a deal breaker. And there was some really great research from a professor at Cornell University, Vanessa Bond, who actually ended up writing a book by this title. There was a HBR post. It was called "You're Already More Persuasive Than You Think." And if you have the guide that I just threw your way, in the guide, I think I can probably, let's see if I can throw this up here. There you go. So point number 2 in the guide, oh, sorry, not point number 2. It's point number... Hold on a sec. It's not point number 2. Here, point number 3. Ask if it's a deal breaker, right? And so she actually talks about the fact that we as sellers often psych ourselves out into thinking, well, shoot, if the customer's coming back with a request, we have to comply with that request. Otherwise, why would they have been asking? And so we don't like this idea of going asking, is it a deal breaker? So Vanessa did this research where she actually was able to prove out that, we are more persuasive than we think. And I believe that's the title of her book. You're more persuasive than you think. And she's like, sometimes we just psych ourselves out and we don't bother to ask, like, hey, is this thing a deal breaker? So, and you can check out the document because it has all sorts of research and the science behind it. Anyways, so the rep comes back. I say, go back to the customer and ask if it's a deal breaker. He's so worried. He comes back and says, you know what? I asked the customer and they're actually okay with annual payments. They were just asking just to ask. So I'm like, great. This is a really great and helpful tactic. If you have, a couple days before your deadline, ask if it's a deal breaker. So I go out on LinkedIn and I put this out as a tactic, hey, everyone, you should go ask like if it's a deal breaker, and so Mark, God bless him, he comes in with, his procurement mind and he's like, well, if you ever tried that, deal breaker shit on me when I was in procurement and you asked me like, hey, is this thing a deal breaker? I would say it might be. Do you want to risk? I still remember, do you want to risk, going back and, for me going back into my organization and seeing if it's a deal breaker and then you have to get approval? Like, you only got a couple days here before your deadline. I'm like, Mark is the man, right? Now, look, there's all these kind of countermeasures that we can use, vis-a-vis these tactics, but I was super pumped to bring Mark on. Maybe I'd love, Mark, maybe just introduce yourself to the crew here. By the way, and my clients know this, I tend to just jump into stuff, assuming that we're all old friends. There's no introductions, there's no nothing. Oh, hey, I'm David. But, I know for some of you, we're friends and we know each other. And for some of you, I don't know you. So let's kick it off with Mark introducing himself first. So welcome, Mark, man. Thanks for joining me today in the crew.
Thank you very much for having me, David. I really appreciate it. And thank you for all of you that have joined in today. I really appreciate it as well. I'm the founder of a company called Negotiations Ninja. I also host the Negotiations Ninja podcast, where we interview the best negotiators in the world to get their insights on how to negotiate. And Negotiations Ninja is a negotiation training and coaching company. I'll pop the link there in the chat if you want to have a look at it. And so David invited me today to talk all about things from negotiating from a procurement perspective, because that's been my world for the last almost 20 years. And so prior to Negotiations Ninja, I led a bunch of categories all throughout procurement and led a few teams. And so David said, hey, wouldn't it be cool if you came on and told the folks that I coach and work with about how to deal with procurement in Q4? And I thought that would be pretty cool. And then he's like, hey, can I position you as the asshole in this conversation? And I said, that's fine too, because that's basically the role that I've filled for a long time. So that's why I'm here today.
There you go. I asked permission, just so you know, before. I'm like, I'm going to call you a jerk in this promotion email. Is that okay? And he's like, absolutely. So yeah, and oftentimes, when we're negotiating at month end, like the pressure's on, like I said, especially now, like every deal is precious. And so I wanted to kind of, approach this from a couple angles. Number one is, what are just some really good tactics that we can use to, you're going to talk about concession management. And a lot of times we think about negotiations as the minimizing of concessions, although there's a lot of feelings obviously involved in negotiation as well. And sometimes when we feel like we're not being treated fairly, we lash out and take illogical positions. But we want to talk about concession management. But as well, like to your point, Mark, is approaching it from the perspective a little bit of like procurement, right? And the beauty of someone in procurement is like it's their complete and total job. And I'm going to pull a Ricky Bobby and say, with all due respect, is to be like a jerk. With all due respect, is to be a jerk to you. They don't care about the business per se. They don't care about like the functional benefits or whatever is going to happen from using your product or service. Their job is just to get the thing that you're selling for the cheapest amount of money. And so kind of getting in the mind of procurement, as I kind of said earlier in the week when we were talking, like if you can do a good job of negotiating with a procurement specialist, then almost like negotiating with a VP of whatever, like the frontline leader, is easy. So I'd love to just maybe turn it over to you first, and let's talk about some of these, concessions that you often find people, that you train people on, but also that you find people give away either too much, too quickly, or inappropriately when they're dealing with procurement or someone buying products from them.
Yeah, I think probably the single biggest problem that I see amongst most salespeople whenever they're negotiating with procurement people is an anxiety. And that anxiety is palpable, right? Like procurement people can see it and they can smell it and they can almost taste it. And they're like sharks, right? Once they start smelling blood in the water, that they're going to go for that blood. So as soon as you start to express that level of anxiety, that's where the procurement person starts to dig in. And that's most visible, especially with any kind of SaaS or software-based organization at the end of a month, quarter, or fiscal year end. Because we know that most people are trying to meet quota during that time. And so we're going to utilize that stress and that anxiety to our advantage in every opportunity that we can. And when I say that, like a lot of salespeople are like, what an asshole. Like, why would you do that? But the reality is that's my job, right? It's my job to try and extract as much value from the conversation as I can. I care very deeply about what the business user wants. But if we're negotiating, that doesn't mean that I'm going to just let you have it without having you work for it. My job is to now attract as much value to the organization and extract as much value out of the negotiation as humanly possible. So I'm going to utilize that to as best to my ability as I can. And one of the key things that I see with a lot of people is when a procurement person or anyone really asks for something, especially with that anxiety that's built towards the end of the quarter or the fiscal, there's a tendency to just give, right? Like I ask, you give, and there's no reciprocity that exists with that. At no point in time, very, very rarely, does a salesperson ask for something in return for the thing that I've asked for. And that's the single biggest problem that I see with most negotiations at the end of the quarter, because it's just a one-way concession strategy, and I'm going to utilize that. And by the way, I know that Simon Sinek is like super popular for talking about reciprocity in terms of, give without the expectation of getting anything in return. That's bullshit when it comes to negotiation. Like that doesn't apply, right? If you're going to give me something and not ask for anything in return, I'm going to keep asking for those things until someone says no. And then I'm going to continue asking until someone gets upset. And then I'm going to continue asking and escalating on that to see how far I can push it. It's my job to be able to do that. And your job is to be able to manage that conversation.
I love it. This concept of like no unilateral concessions is really, really important. And, it doesn't mean that you both have to kind of, fixate on price or revenue like a dog on a bone. There could be all sorts of other things that, let's say Mark feels are important to him versus there might be something that I might ask for that might be easy for Mark to give. It's not like we all have to be kind of adversarial on this. But I love what you're saying in terms of like the emotions. And, we talk about this in my content, my practice, even, something simple, we talk about feelings, and you're saying like, you can smell the blood on the water. I always give the example when my kids come to me and they're about to hit me up for something that they think I'm going to say no to, like I can tell immediately just by the way they approach me, and it makes me feel, defensive. As a seller, sometimes if we can come into these negotiations with almost like we're independently wealthy, we don't need this deal kind of, I've already made my quote, I'm going to Hawaii attitude, it can sometimes help us negotiate better. So controlling your mindset is really important. I don't know if you have any mindset tips for sellers when negotiating with procurement.
The best mindset tip is for me to recommend a book that I think you should all read. It's called You Can Negotiate Anything by a gentleman by the name of Herb Cohen. He was so good at understanding other people and the situation that they were in, is that he was the guy that advised Jimmy Carter on the Iranian hostage crisis in the 70s, and he predicted the release of the hostages down to the hour because he understood human behavior so well. So that's the best book in terms of like mindset that I think you should be able to negotiate with. And his saying, which I love, his saying in the book is, the mindset that I want you to have is that you want the deal. I absolutely want the deal, no question, but I don't need the deal.
Mm-hmm.
If you can approach it with that kind of a mindset, it becomes much easier to retain value in the conversation.
100%.
But again, that's a function of like, do you actually need the deal? Because if you actually need the deal, you're going to have to really work hard at developing that mindset and also your pipeline.
Well, look, that's why, sales is hard. And Federico, you asked for the name of the book again. It's called You Can Negotiate Anything by Herb Cohen. I wrote it down here. Maybe
Yeah, fantastic book. I recommend it to everyone.
someone kind might find it on Amazon and throw it in the Zoom chat here for us. But in one of the things that we think about when it's close to our deadline, and it's kind of almost implied, is time. We may not have time to negotiate. It's almost like the old saying, the best time to plant a tree was 30 years ago. Now the second best time is now. So when we're negotiating, oftentimes we don't leave ourselves enough time and room to negotiate, and we kind of find ourselves in these situations. But you and I were talking earlier, and it's funny because I teach and kind of talk about this on the sales side, which is like when you ask for something, sometimes it's actually good to let that concession sit there for a little bit, like let it lie, give it time, because one thing that customers don't love is being forced or cornered into making a decision quickly. And when you allow them time to explore the offer, even if the offer doesn't get better or change at all in any way, you're giving them the opportunity to kind of, come to you a little bit. Now, sometimes we don't have the luxury of time, but you were mentioning to me that from a procurement standpoint, sometimes you intentionally go dark on the customer. So I love, from that angle, and certainly even from the sales angle that you teach your clients as well, like what are some of the thoughts that you have in terms of like the time implications, like where you might want to take some time, or where, you should get worried that the customer's not getting back to you? What do you think about these time strategies?
Yeah, I think the use of time in negotiations is incredibly powerful, and it's not a new idea, right? Like this was part of Aristotle's planning when he came to talk about rhetoric. He said you need logos, pathos, ethos, and the last thing was kairos, which is using time effectively. And whenever you think of the utilization of time, primarily I want people to think of it in two different ways. The first way is, when is the best time to ask for something? And sometimes we don't have that kind of luxury, but generally we can say, okay, late Friday afternoon, bad time. Early Monday morning, bad time. Other than that, you should be fairly okay. But also how to utilize time to extract value or increase anxiety in the conversation. And this is what a lot of procurement people do with salespeople, is if I know that there's something, everyone familiar with the term commission breath? I don't know if you've heard that term before,
I
but
think even if you're not familiar, like,
procurement people have this term for salespeople when they say, "Oh, he or she or they have commission breath," and you can smell it on a salesperson when they come into the conversation. And if you're too thirsty for that commission, if you're too thirsty for that sale, I'm going to utilize time to the best of my advantage to make you increase the probability of concession. So, for example, if you've made a proposal to me and we've had our first conversation, and you've said, hey, this is what we're trying to do, and I've been super cordial, I'm always going to be really friendly, I'm going to be polite, kind, and courteous, and then as soon as we get into the conversation about the numbers and the commercial aspect of the deal, the first thing I'm going to go to is, hey, listen, all of that fun stuff aside, I like you as a person, but I didn't know that I was going to be dealing with second-grade dog food in your proposal. This is a problem. All right. Now, I'm sure you're a very nice person, and I'm sure your company does very nice things. But here's the reality. Even though you've had a conversation with my business user and they really want to use you, you don't have a deal yet. Nothing has been signed. There is no contract. And until such time as a deal is signed and a contract is put in place, you have to work with me. And during this time together, I have some expectations. Now, here's what I want you to do. Work on this proposal and make it better. Thank you so much for your time. Go back to that. And then they send me a better proposal, and that's when I go dark. As soon as that happens, I go dark, and then usually it's like 6 or 7 business days later that a salesperson starts sending an email, because there's so much anxiety that's been building up in that salesperson to say, well, I don't know if I'm going to get this. I maybe it wasn't good enough. Maybe my re-proposal wasn't great. Maybe I should reach out. I don't know what's going on. And the first email comes is like, have you had a chance to review the proposal? and then I don't answer. And then the second email comes usually 2 days later, right? So we go from 7 days where the salesperson's trying to be strong to 2 days later. And like, hey, if you're at all concerned about any of the things in the proposal, please let me know. That's usually the second email that I get. The third email I get is, hey, look, I mean, we could talk about this and negotiate things. I'm sure we can sharpen our pencil a little bit, or some derivative of that saying, for you to be able to be happy with this. And then I still don't answer. And then that's when the anxiety is really starting to build. And as soon as I know that there's more room where the person has said we can sharpen our pencil, that's when I'll initiate a conversation to say, hey, why don't we have a discussion about this? I'm a little bit concerned about your proposal. So I'm going to increase the anxiety again. I'm not going to say it's bad. All I'm saying is that I'm concerned. I'm concerned about your proposal. And then immediately a salesperson says, no problem. Happy to have a conversation. Let's set up a time. Here's a calendar link. We set up some time to have a calendar link, and then I get another concession immediately, basically in the next conversation. So the utilization of that time is really, really powerful at eliciting concessions and increasing the probability of concessions. And if you're wondering to yourself, holy shit, I can't believe this is an actual strategy that people are using, I'm sorry, it is. It's a real thing.
You know, I was gonna, as you were going, you all almost reminded me of my wife's teacher voice. You know, it's like,
right.
She's very nice and a lovely woman, but then every now and then she goes into the teacher voice. I'm like, holy shit, this is not good. And so I feel like I need to remind everyone that Mark is actually a very lovely man, and he's just using his negotiation voice.
Sure. Look, and I think that's the reality of the situation, folks. Is like, if we all know that negotiation is really primarily two big parts, right? It's emotion and logic. You've all been taught that. But if I can make your emotions a certain way, I'm going to. Like, if I can leverage your emotion to increase the probability of fear of loss, that's a great strategy for me, because now I can extract more value out of the conversation.
So let me ask you this. So I'm going to venture a guess to say that everyone on the session today, out of all the people and everyone listening to this in the replay, no one here wants to have a career in procurement. So the free procurement
we certainly
training
make a lot less than in sales.
You see, this is the price we pay for all the stress and anxiety. Is like, you know, we at the end of the day we can get the big paycheck. So the question I have is that for all the people on the phone here that are on the sales side of things, what advice do you have from a countermeasure perspective, or to deal with those time pressures that you're forcing on them? If you were on the other side, which you are, what would you advise them to do?
If you're in that kind of a situation where someone has gone dark on you, I have no problem with you reaching out after like 5 to 7 days to say, hey, have you had a chance to look at the proposal? Let me know your thoughts. That's fine. But be very cautious of the frequency of communication that you have after that, because if you resend another email like within 2 to 3 days of that, then that's a little bit of danger. Now I'm starting to catch on that you might be a little bit desperate in that kind of a situation. Just be cautious of that. And the wording in your email is very, very important. Like, saying, I want to go over the points of the proposal, totally fine. Saying, did you have any questions about it? Totally fine. But as soon as you say, do you have any concerns? Now I know that you're concerned, right? Like, if I know that you're concerned, that's where I'm going to dig into that conversation. And I would just ask the question in the email to say, hey, if you have any things that you want to chat about, any points that you want to discuss, feel free to reach out to me. Here's a calendar link. Here's my email. Here's my phone number. Give me a shout anytime. Until such time as I hear from you, I'm going to assume that we're good to go.
So there's this element,
and then flip it, and then wait for them to respond.
So it's almost like you're giving me all these vibes of like, okay, you go on a date with someone, and I thought the date went good, and then they don't call me afterwards, and then I kind of follow up, and then if the more frequently I keep following up, the more desperate I seem. So
Right.
you just got to be cool. All the more reason, kids, is to start the negotiations as early as you can. And you all know this. We all try to negotiate as early as we can. Sometimes it's not possible, especially when you're dealing with procurement. But if we were to kind of let's take a step back and say, okay, we don't always deal with procurement, when we're negotiating, certainly like bigger contracts, bigger companies. I totally get that. And by the way, so one thing I want to mention as far as, not coming off as seeming too desperate, there's a lot of little subtle tactics that sometimes I'm mindful of, and it's one of these things maybe we don't always are kind of are conscious of it. Simple things like, let's say for example, you speak to a prospect and you say like, hey, I'm Sammy from such and such Denim Social, such and such a company. Hey Sammy, and I'd love to chat. And they say sure, let's set up a time. Sometimes what sellers will do is they'll say, okay, great, like give me your calendar and I'll pick something. But the problem is if you see my calendar and there's like a million appointments there's no sense of like scarcity or like I'm busy, and it's very hard for me to kind of maintain that thing. And so what sometimes people will do, which I recommend, is don't give someone your entire calendar, like give them specific times to pick from. Like here's a bunch of times to pick from, right? And it creates that element of scarcity as well. Sometimes as well on the countermeasure front, and we would do this, a bunch at Salesforce and other companies, is let's say you're negotiating with a customer at month end and we're talking, maybe not necessarily with procurement, but we're talking about concessions. We might say, hey, look, I have the ear of my, SVP or whatever it is to get approval for some kind of concession. I'm not going to say what it is, because if I say what it is, then you're going to hold me to it. But of course, it's the end of our quarter, it's the end of our year, whatever it is. And obviously they're getting bombarded with all sorts of, requests and proposals from people. So if I bring it to them, like it has to be good. I have to have a level of confidence that it can be something that's executed on your side. And there's like a time horizon that we can see. Because what I don't want to do, Mark, is I don't want to throw out a discount, somehow run up the flagpole, get the concession, give it to you, and then all of a sudden you realize, shit, I can't get this thing done. So what I'm doing is I'm creating a little bit of time scarcity and attention scarcity on my side to kind of counter a little bit of yours. So I want to talk about some of these kind of more like mainstream negotiation tactics, because when it comes to concession management and not giving away too much, it's funny. And I want to talk about, your concept of concession management and some of the things that sellers do that cause them to give away too much revenue.
Yeah.
One thing I will say, which I'm pretty sure is not stepping on your toes, because you're not going to talk about this per se, as we talk about this concept of time pressure. I did a little experiment at Salesforce, and I said, you know what? I want to get a sense for the magnitude of concessions we're giving. And in this case, I was just looking at price concessions. And I said, I want you to show me the discount that all of my reps are giving on every single day of the month. Like on the first, on the second, on the third, like I want to know across all the reps, what's the average discount they're getting or giving. And what I found was in every month, and we were like a monthly business, and I know a lot of businesses are, the magnitude of discounts we were giving in the first 3 weeks of the month I would say were half of the discounts we were giving in the last week, or the discounts we were giving last week were double, the rest of the month. And, it was only recently that I took a step back and I thought, look, every deal is precious. So if all I did was negotiate all my deals before the last week of the month, I would actually have to close fewer deals, because I wouldn't be giving it, because I get comped on revenue, not deals. I would have to close fewer deals. So I want to throw it back to you. What are some of the things you see salespeople do that result in them needlessly giving away revenue?
I think the discount, we know, like procurement people know the biggest discount always comes at the end of the month, quarter, or fiscal. We know that. So we might delay a deal right to the end to be able to get that discount. And when that discount is offered, we know it's available. So we know it's not going to go away. So it doesn't matter if we execute on that at the end of the month, quarter, or fiscal. So once it's available, we'll just contact you the next month and be like, hey, we'll buy it now at the same deal. Thank you very much. Because we know you're not going to walk away. So when it comes to managing concessions, there's really primarily 3 things that I want people to think about. The first is basically conditional giving, right? We spoke about this a little bit at the beginning. When someone asks you for something, you always ask for something in return. So if you say, hey, Mark, you're going into a renewal, you say, I need a 10% increase. I might say, I might be able to do that if you can do something for me. And if we flip that from the other side of the table, procurement says, I need a 10% decrease. You say, I might be able to do that if you can do, and then we ask for something in return. So that's conditional giving. Second layer of concession strategy is something called portional giving. So if someone asks me for something, I only give a portion of that thing. So let's say you ask me for, I'm a salesperson and I ask for 10% more or something like that. A procurement person might say, I might be able to do that. I might be able to do 2% if you can do something for me. So they're only going to give a portion of that thing. Same as a procurement person asks you for a deal. If they ask you for a 10% decrease on your pricing or a 20% decrease on your pricing, you might say, I might be able to do 2% if you can do X for me, or 5% if you can do X for me. Determine whatever your number is. And then the third layer of concession strategy, by the way, even if you're giving a portional concession, you always still ask for something in return. So these strategies apply regardless of what layer you're at. The third layer of concession strategy is managing the perception of the scarcity about what is available. I love what you said earlier, David, around managing the scarcity of time. Concession management is the same. So, like, what happens, hypothetical question to everyone, what happens to the value of a good or a service the more scarce that we make that good or the service? The perceived value of that thing goes up, right? So if I can manage your perception about what the availability of a concession might be, your perceived value of that concession goes up. You could do this too. If you concede less and make it more difficult for me to get the thing that I want, not like super hard, but make it a little bit challenging, then my perceived value of that thing starts to go up. And so I liken it, I always give the example of, let's just say, for example, you were into golf. But you're frugal and you want to buy a used set of golf clubs, and you go onto Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist or Kijiji or whatever it is you use, and you find out that someone in your neighborhood is selling the used set of golf clubs that you want to buy. And you go to that person's house and you check them out, and it's wonderful. It's exactly what you're looking for. And they've listed it for $250. And you tell the person right away, I'll take this off your hands for $200. And immediately they say yes. And they take your $200 and they give you the golf clubs and they walk away. How good do you feel about that purchase? Probably not very good, right? You probably feel some buyer's remorse because now you're thinking that was too easy, right? I didn't ask for enough. But let me ask you the same question a different way. What if you negotiated with that person for 20 minutes and you ended up at $220? Would you feel better? Now, objectively, $200 is a better deal than $220. But you would feel better about the $220 deal because you had to work for it and because scarcity was managed. The negotiation created the scarcity of the concessions, which increased your perceived value. So you walk away feeling happy. You walk away feeling like you've won from that negotiation. And you can do the same thing in your negotiation. So the more scarce that you make a concession, the higher perceived value that you get that. Now, there's obviously a threshold there, right? You can't make it too scarce because otherwise they'll just walk away from the deal. So the question then becomes, how do you manage the scarcity of the deal? Firstly, when someone asks you for a concession, the single biggest issue that I see with a lot of salespeople when this happens is they go, we could absolutely consider that. So they're already saying that they're going to look into it without any kind of hesitation, right? And so it looks like to a procurement person, like, okay, obviously there's a lot of room here. I'm going to keep pushing. But if your first response is, generally, it's quite difficult for us to give on this kind of a thing, I'm not sure if I can do that. Like if you're building the thought in my mind that it might not necessarily be there and you're not sure, and you'd have to look into it, and this is beyond your sort of decision criteria or what you're allowed to do, that's going to make me feel like there is higher scarcity to the thing that I'm asking for. It's going to increase my perceived value of that thing. It's going to make me feel like I get a better deal if I actually do get that thing, or even a portion of that thing, hence the point of portional giving. But then what a lot of salespeople do is, if I'm a procurement person and let's just say I ask for a 20%, I know these are like round numbers, just for the sake of round numbers, if I ask for a 20% decrease on something, salespeople give the equivalent amount in each request that I ask for. So even if they give portionally, right? So if I ask for 20% and let's just say they give 3%, and then I ask again and then they give another 3%, and then I ask again and then they give another 3%. What I am being trained to think as a procurement person is that with each request, there is an equal concession that I get back in return. And this is a major problem because now you're training me to believe that with each request I have, there's the same amount. So I should keep asking.
Mm-hmm.
And some salespeople even go the opposite way. They say, well, I could give 3%, and then they increase it. And they're like, okay, we'll give 5%. I'm like, whoa, maybe there's no limit here. I'll just keep asking until I get more. Instead, what I want you to do is taper down those concessions. So instead of giving an equal amount, you might say, okay, I can give 3% or 5%, whatever you start at. But then the next incremental concession that you give is maybe instead of 3%, it's 2%. And then the next one you give is not 2%, maybe it's 1.3%. And then the next one you give is like 0.5%. So you're training me as a procurement person to know that there is now a series of diminishing returns with each request that I make. And at no point in time should you ever say, this is the best I can do. But now you're training me to think that this is probably the best that they can do because there is less and less and less available. So now without even saying this is the best we can do, this is the lowest we can go, this is the, any of these absolute terms, which are not good terms to begin with, now I'm being trained that there's less and less and less available. But in order to be confident enough to be able to even have that conversation, you need to be having that conversation early enough in the negotiation so that you give yourself time to be able to taper those concessions, which a lot of us don't do. A lot of us save that conversation for the end when I know that there's going to be a big windfall anyway.
100%. Well, it sounds like this concept, and for all of you listening, this concept of time is something that keeps coming up. Give yourself time, you'll give away less, and you'll create more. What Mark is saying, like he's talking about this concept of value and scarcity, which I agree with. I approach it also from another angle, which is satisfaction.
Right.
People don't like to feel like they've been taken advantage of. They want to feel like they got a good deal. They want to feel good that they worked you a little bit to get what they ended up getting in the end. When they feel satisfied, there's lots of things, by the way, that we can do to promote satisfaction in deals. I'm going to actually throw this up. This is actually a quote that I show in my negotiation training curriculum from, I know you hear this all the time, Chris Voss, right? Never Split the Difference. That researchers have found that people getting concessions feel better about the bargaining process than those who are given a firm, fair offer. Exactly what Mark said, right? And this is the most important thing, they feel better even when they end up paying more, like your $220 bike, right? Like if I had to work you to get to that $220, I'm going to feel a lot better about that than even when I paid more than just getting that, right off the bat. And you see this as well, like in job employment negotiations. Like, I'm trying to figure out what should I ask for? Should I ask for like 100,000 or 200,000? I'm like, I'm going to ask for 200,000, and they say, okay. I'm like, shit, I should have asked for more. Like that was too easy, right? So that's number one. The other thing which I really like, this idea of like the tapering of the discounts points to, and I approach this from a slightly different angle, but I've never thought of like the tapering per se, but I do agree with you, and this is funny, that like everything that we do trains the other side.
Yes.
And, when, at Salesforce, I know there's some folks here on the call from Salesforce. We used to call the end of year January magic, or Q4 magic, right? And Q4 magic or January magic was just code for a few things. Number one, working at an unsustainable level of effort. So we would just, go kiss our families goodbye January 1st. We'll say we'll see you on, at the end of the month. And then, certainly there's lots of concessions, but also because historically we always hustled at the end of the year and left it to the last minute, when do you think all the renewals come up? Right? So like we're actually shooting ourselves in the foot. One of the things that I love as it relates to like that tapering down is actually a concept I refer to as, and you touched on it, deliberate discounting. So when you ask me for a concession and I start saying, oh yeah, 10, 5, 10, 20%, I give you like these round number percentages, it feels very arbitrary. Oh, all right, well, if you offered me 10, like you might as well offer me 15, right?
Right.
Versus if I said, I can only offer you like 3.72%. I'm making
very
this up.
Specific number.
Very specific. And, I like the
idea. Which means nothing.
Yeah. Well, so here's the thing. Like, if it means nothing, it seems deliberate when you're doing it. Right. I always like to have, like, conviction behind the number. So if I pick a weird percentage discount, what I almost would want to see is that weird percentage discount might actually turn out to be a nice rounder number if I look at, for example, the absolute price per user. So, for example, if I have, let me see if I can even pull some of this up. I have some training on this, and I don't want to go through it here. I will actually put a link in the Zoom chat to a video where I kind of went through this more intently. So it's all free. You can, by all means, go to check it out. But like, for example, if you're negotiating a price per user, and let's say the price per user is $125, and now I'm given 10, 15, 20, 25% discounts, you can see like the actual value of revenue I'm giving away. Versus if I said, well, you know what? Let me give away like $5 off, right? $5 off is 4%. And 4% is kind of like a bit of a weird, it's not like 3.29%, but it's a bit of a weird number. And so my thing to you is that sometimes, and I believe in the training, I go on the reverse, which is like, sometimes if you're negotiating on hard dollar values, maybe you're actually better served to negotiate on percentage value. So I say, like, go through this matrix, and actually just to kind of drive the point here, is that like, if I were to throw out a 15% discount, that's actually, quite a bit. But if I said, hey, I'll give you $10 off, which actually sounds substantial, like it sounds like something, I'm actually giving away a much lesser discount. So thinking about, exactly what Mark said, tapering my discounts, but also not leading with very conspicuous numbers that make the discount seem arbitrary. There you go. So Mark, you mentioned the other thing, we were talking earlier about this concept of, now that we're talking about like splitting the difference. I'm sure everyone would be keen to hear, oftentimes we're negotiating and, we come at something and the other person comes at something and we're thinking, okay, why don't we just be fair and split the difference? What do you were telling me, like, what's the tactic that you, as a procurement mind, you kind of fall back on to chisel people down?
I want you to split the difference. I want you to offer to split the difference. Like, and usually you would never split the difference until you were like right at the end of the negotiation. You're really close, right? Let's just say you're at 100, I'm at 80. I've expressed to you sort of where I am, and I need you to move closer to me. And then you say, Mark, why don't we just split the difference at 90? I'm going to use, and we've all heard this before, and I don't know how many procurement people you've heard this from, but I'll say, hey, David, I really, really appreciate that. I'm not sure if I can do that. Let me tell you what I'll do. How many times have you heard this? I'll fight for you. Let me go back to my team, and I'll see what I can do. So I go back to my team, which really doesn't exist in the first place. Mm-hmm. Maybe it does. I don't know, depending on the person. And I would come back to David, and I would say, David, good news and bad news. Here's the good news. We want to keep talking to you. So now I'm making you feel like, oh, whoa, there was an option. I wasn't going to keep. Oh, shit. Okay. So I'm making you feel like, okay, there was a situation where this wasn't going to go well. So good news. We want to keep talking to you. Bad news. We can't do 90. We just can't. It's really, really hard for us. But we're really close now. Right? Like, I feel like you're at 90, we're at 80. And so what I've done is I've assumed your concession. I've now assumed that you've come down to 90. So you're at 90, I'm at 80. We're really, really close. I think if you could get just a little bit closer to 80, I might be able to work this with my team. And so David's a smart negotiator. So he might say, well, how much closer do we need to get? Then I would say, it really does need to be closer to that 80 number. But look, I mean, you've invested so much into this, David. Like, you've invested a ton into this process. Your team's invested a lot into this process. You guys have already put in a bunch of work. That POC was fantastic, and I mean, we really like your product. We don't want to walk away. So now I'm not saying that I'm going to walk away. I'm saying I don't want to walk away, which makes you believe that there is an option that I'm going to walk away.
Mhm.
So I'm going to say, David, I don't want to walk away from this deal. I know how much effort that you've put into this. What do you think we should do? And now I'm utilizing your emotion to be able to get you to propose something that's better than 90 for me. So you're going to say, we could probably do 85. And I was like, or even 87, let's say. I would be like, I know we wanted it closer to 80, David. Before I take this back to my team and determine what decision they want to make and what course of action they want to take. Again, I'm making you think that there is like, oh, what do you mean? What decision? What do you mean? What course of action? I'm making you think that way. Before I take this back to my team, can you make it better? Can you make it better than the 87? Because I know they want it to be closer to 80, and I don't want to take this to them and then they say something that I don't want them to say. And
Mhm.
again, I'm causing doubt in your mind.
Mhm.
Then you're going to say, okay, let me get back to you. Then you get back to me and you say, we could do 86 or 85. And then I'd be like, okay, I hear you. Let me go back. Then I might say, okay, David, we could do the 86 or the 85 if you can do net 120 payment terms. And then I'm going to ask for something else and bring something else in. And then you're going to say, whoa, net 120, like this is a prepaid deal. Like, hey, well, listen, David, like this is the way it is. I mean, otherwise, I don't know what they're going to do. And then now we're starting to negotiate payment terms. And so I'm going to keep nibbling on that side of the deal. So be very careful if you offer to split the difference, because as soon as you offer to split the difference, I'm going to use that against you. So the
Mhm.
goal here is not to offer to split the difference, but to get the counterparty to offer to split the difference. Because as
Mhm.
soon as the counterparty offers to split the difference, now you can run the same routine, right?
Mhm.
And get them to move up. But it becomes very challenging if you offer to split the difference. And how you get the counterparty to split the difference is by tying in their emotion, right? Like the same way that I did with David. I said, you work really hard on this, blah, blah, blah. I know you might say, look, I know the business user really, really wants this. Timelines are really, really tight. I know that you want to implement this really, really quickly. I don't really know what to do from here. What do you suggest we do? So
Mhm.
you're going to get them to offer to split the difference, and you say, we might not be able to make that work, but let me check. And then you run the same routine.
100%. Well, one of the things that almost in our dialogue here we're presupposing is that as the seller, I'm coming in with full authority to negotiate the deal. Like I can offer whatever I want. I know we were kind of talking about, well, I need approval from A, B, and C, but it almost sounds like, one of the secrets is to consider, and I'm a big fan of this as well. Like consider the balance of power going into the negotiation and how much you want to have. The example I often give is, let's say this is a fictitious story. I'm experiencing a midlife crisis, and I say, you know what? I want to go into like the Porsche dealership to buy like a fancy sports car to prove that like I still got it. And I go in and I
That
drive like
sounds
the
like an
car.
oddly specific example, by
Oddly
the way. It
specific.
doesn't
Yeah,
sound like
it's
a
not
Christmas
a
story.
911 Turbo S in the Miami blue. No, I'm just kidding. I'm too pragmatic a guy to start going down that road. But yeah, I'm picking it up tonight, as Sammy said in the thing. So I go into the dealership, I drive the car, and it's really nice. And the dealer's asking me like, so how do you feel? I'm like, oh look, I love this stuff. Can I ask like this spec, this color, this like how much are we talking here, right? And he says whatever like 200,000, 100, whatever, $200,000, okay? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm like, you know what? I love this car, and if it was up to me, I would be signing today. But you know who would kill me if I spent that
Right.
much money on a car, right? And maybe you're probably thinking maybe it's my wife or my partner, whoever, right? And maybe I'm not even married, right? Maybe this is a fictitious person, but I'm going to use that as the well look. And by the way, let's say my wife, maybe I'm not even married, but I am married. Are you ever going to have my wife in the dealership here to negotiate with? Like they're the real decision maker. And it's kind of reminding me as kind of a little funny story. Oftentimes when I would hire people, hire sales reps in my startups, one of the things they would say is they say, look, I got to talk about this with my wife or my husband, my partner, right? Because this is a big decision to join a company, also like a venture funded early stage company. It might impact us from a lifestyle perspective, taking more options, a little less salary. And I'm like, hey, look, totally fair. And I want you to feel very comfortable. And I would actually offer to speak to these people's significant others on the phone. And a bunch took me up on it. I had many conversations with partners and spouses because I said, look, I want you to know, your husband, wife, your partner, like, I want you to know they're going into a good place and that I'm going to be taking care of them, right? So getting to these hidden players is sometimes very powerful. But as sellers, we can use the players in our own organization. And if you think about like who makes a great player in our own organization, I got to go to Christina, our SVP of sales, to get approval for this. I got to go to Puneet, who's our CFO, or our controller. Like maybe these people don't exist. Maybe we don't even have a CFO, right? Or even if we did, you're not going to get on the phone with this person. But I can use them as kind of like the foil to say, well, like I got to go back too. So it sounds like you're a bit of an advocate of that as well, is to kind of like say, look,
yeah, very much so. And I think the pushback or the objection that you'll get from a procurement person if you do that is like, well, if you're not authorized to make this decision, then why am I speaking to you? And then so the answer to that question is, look, there are certain things that I can do, and there are certain things that I can't do. What you're asking for is something I can't do. I can't make that decision on my own. In much the same way, procurement person, whoever you're dealing with, Jill, Jenny, whatever it is, like in much the same way that you can't make a decision to actually purchase this thing. You make a proposal internally about the value that you've created and all of the things that you've got going on, but you can't make that decision. Same as me, right? Both of us have people that we report into. And so I just can't make that without getting someone else's approval. So as long as you can have that frank conversation with someone, that's great.
And look, not only like is that a good conversation to have, but I actually advocate for companies to have these approval matrices and layers of protection like in place because it makes it easier for you to not give in. You're like, when I say I can't give you that, like the reality is I can't, right? And by the way, even if you're not in that position, like for example, I'm frequently in this position. I'll give you like some frank, honest, tactics and approaches that I use. Because like I'm the person in my business. So when people negotiate with me for agreements, it's not like I can't go check with someone else. Like I can do theoretically whatever I want. And so sometimes it's not about infusing the authority and power into a person, but into like a policy or a standard.
I've done exactly the same thing. I've set up my own rules about what I can and cannot do. And if people look for a discount, I say, look, you have two levers, volume and term. That's it. If you want to buy a lot of stuff, we can figure something out.
100%. And the reason, and people love, we talk about certainty. People don't like it when you just throw out, like, oh, I need this or you got to do this. People like reasons for things, and the certainty is very powerful.
Yeah.
And so even like, for example, the thing I often say, which is true, is that, all of my clients like typically work in the same industries and they hop from company to company. And I need to have consistency because I would expect that you're going to call your friend at company ABC and say, how much did you pay for David? And if the answer is different, then you're going to be upset. So I maintain consistency as a positive business practice for the benefit of my clients, right? And in that case, I'm invoking a standard that sits outside of this conversation that, can't be touched.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes a ton of sense.
Now, look, I know we just have a few minutes here remaining. I'm happy to open it up. And if any of you have specific questions you want to hit Mark up with, you got like a kind of a month, quarter end deal that you're working, or any thoughts you want to share, I'm happy to entertain them. Feel free to put it in the Zoom chat. I think some people actually ended up sending me some questions via email that I'm struggling to invoke at this point in time. But anyone have any questions?
And if you can't think of any questions, feel free to reach out to me at any point in time. I just put my LinkedIn profile in there.
Yeah.
If you want to.
Nico, great question.
Do you have procurement KPIs that you're tracked against? Yes, we do. Procurement is so in the same way that sales is tracked based on revenue earned, procurement is tracked based on savings generated. But the compensation structure is different. So we don't get comped to the same degree that salespeople do. We will have a number of different goals that we have within the organization, reducing PO cycle time, NPI with our internal customers, those kinds of things, or NPS, depending on what you follow. And then we also have savings. Depending on the organization, savings may make up a larger proportion of our annual goals than in other organizations. So there's no sort of hard and fast rule about organization to organization. But the biggest thing that we are judged on is the value that we're creating for the organization. And that's generally in two different categories when it comes to savings. It's cost reduction, that's year over year savings, and cost avoidance is the second one. And cost avoidance is like, let's say you propose a 20% increase, but we only pay 5% increase. I've avoided 15%. So that's cost avoidance. So those are the two big areas that we're judged on. There's a bunch of other areas, but those are the two big ones.
Can I ask you then, Mark? So if that's the case, then it would be to my advantage as the seller to basically either go in at list price or higher than list price, because then you get a bigger cost reduction. But my spidey sense is telling me, and experience is telling me, that typically when I get to procurement, I've already given some kind of initial proposal to some stakeholder at some discount of some type, and then you're there to kind of chisel me down
Correct.
even more. So
That's why it's important to involve procurement early in that conversation so
Mm,
that they can claim that.
mm,
Because if they can't claim that, if that was business user generated, they can't ethically claim that as savings,
mhm.
because that's something the business user did. So involve them earlier so you can give them that reward.
Yeah. Kim has a question here about working through. Maybe we'll just take one or two more. A question about RFPs, working through the process with RFPs. What's your
Yeah,
experience
I
with
mean,
them?
look, you have to be competitive, right? So if you're in an RFP, I generally, depending on what you're selling and the industry that you're selling into, RFPs is probably how they might even run the procurement of that industry. So, an example is like heavy industrial, commodity-based organizations, factory kind of stuff. Lots of RFPs, very few actual face-to-face negotiations until you get into top two basically of that RFP process. So you're unfortunately bound by the competitive nature of the RFP, but that doesn't mean that you can't also negotiate,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if unless of course you're under like strict governmental criteria, like a lot of like government procurement organizations are bound by public procurement law, which is different federally and state to state. So it depends where you're negotiating there. But if you're negotiating in private, you're not in public,
Mm-hmm.
then generally you can negotiate beyond what it is you've done. So even if you've submitted a proposal, if they ask for something that's outside of that proposal, ask for more back of a particular thing. So if you submit a proposal and they say, well, we want to add this scope to it, well, obviously that's going to increase your price. That doesn't diminish what you've already sent in to get to that top two spot. And a lot of people don't think you can do that. You absolutely can do that.
Mm-hmm. Love it. Well, look, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We are at the top of the. I'm sure we could go on forever here because there's a lot of nuance to negotiation, and I'm sure a lot of people are trying to close business at the end of the year. But first of all, I appreciate all of you for sticking with us and joining us today, and especially Mark. This is awesome, man. I love the wisdom,
Thanks for having me, dude.
the cerebral nature of what you do. You're part of the familiar here, so. Thank you so much, and I'll make sure that all of your information goes out when we share this with the crew. But thank you everyone again for tuning in here today. I hope you enjoyed it, and good luck with your Q4 deals.